those things. I said, we know her sleep habits. She might just so I'm not too freaky, but we stay in touch with through your parents. So it's like I feel like I know everything that's going on. That's the risk when your parents are exist. Yeah, she only tells me.
Let me introduce you to Hi, this is Shanker. This is our son,
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and it's a particular treat for me to be hosting both Thomas Shanker and Andy Hoehn, who are here to talk about their new book, Age of Danger, Keeping America Safe in an Era of New Superpowers, New Weapons, and New Threats. It's a particular treat for me because I knew both of these guys in my previous life as a journalist. Tom and I covered the Pentagon together back during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was with the Washington Post then, and he was reporting for the New York Times. And let me tell you, he was tough competition. He eventually went on to become an editor at the Times, managing their national security and foreign policy coverage, and also co-authored a bestseller, Counterstrike, the untold story of America's secret campaign against al-Qaeda. After nearly 2.5 decades with the Times, and before that some years with the Chicago Tribune, Tom, a couple of years ago, left journalism to direct the Project for Media and National Security at George Washington University, right, where he works now. Andy is well into his third decade in defense, the defense policy arena. He spent about half the first part of that, about 15 years, at the Pentagon, where he helped shape U.S. military strategy, policy, and planning. And the other more recent half, the past 15 or plus years, he spent at the Rand Corporation, where he's now Senior Vice President and Director of Research. So clearly, these two guys have a lot of experience thinking and writing about military and national security matters. And as might be expected, they've produced a very thoughtful and insightful book about what more can be done to ensure America is better protected. Their book begins with an observation and a couple of questions. The observation is that the government currently spends a hell of a lot of money on national security, roughly $1.25 trillion annually, which is a whopping amount. Yet, as the authors note, our national security apparatus often has been stunned by events at home and abroad. So Tom and Andy address two basic questions. First, how is it possible that our public institutions seem so unprepared and get it wrong on so many critical issues? And second, what can be done to make our national security apparatus operate better? In the Age of Danger, Tom and Andy argue that our national security system needs an overhaul, both to provide better intelligence and warnings, and also to respond more effectively. And the authors propose some ways to achieve this. They're very persuasive, as you'll hear in a minute, and hopefully the case they make will help bring about new strategies, processes, and institutional tools to deal with the challenges posed by rival superpowers China and Russia, and such future threats as pandemics, cyber attacks, drones, and climate change. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Thom Shanker and Andy Hoehn.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thanks to everybody for coming out today on this rainy day in Washington. It's such an honor for Andy and me to be at what's truly our hometown bookstore. Brad mentioned that we competed, friendly competition, traveled a lot. I remember one night we were on one of those 27-hour flights back from Iraq, and Brad and I were sitting in back chatting away after a long day, and one of Rumsfeld's top aides said, New York Times, Washington Post, Macy's, Gimbels, you guys can't collaborate. So it's great that we can collaborate today so wonderfully. As you'll see shortly, Andy's the brains of this operation, so he's going to kick us off here.
Tom, thanks so much. And Brad, thank you for having us, and just really welcome the discussion with the group today. You might wonder, how does a longtime national security insider, me, and a longtime reporter, Tom, come together to write a book like this? As Brad said, I entered the Pentagon just as the Cold War was winding down. I was part of the team that helped write the first post-Cold War defense strategy. I think the Washington Post got that story when that first came out.
Brad was he used to scoop me all the time.
I was present for the Gulf War, worked on NATO enlargement and issues in the 1990s, was in the Pentagon on 9/11 when the plane came in, a very sad day for us. And I stayed and left shortly after the invasion of Iraq. I've been at RAND since that time, as Brad mentioned. Tom was stationed in Moscow with his wife, Lisa, covered the Balkan Wars, was then assigned to the Pentagon and the New York Times. He's traveled the world with cabinet members, senior military leaders, other top national security officials. We've known each other, what now, Tom? 20 years, right? 20 years. And we become close colleagues as well as close friends. And we've been in contact throughout this time. And I think 4 or 5 years ago, we sat down over lunch. We would do this frequently, 3-4 times a year. And found ourselves coming at this issue, these questions that we're wrestling with. Same questions, different vantage points. I was approaching it as the person on the inside or wrestling with these topics in the work we were doing to support the Pentagon and the larger national security establishment. Tom was still at the New York Times. And what we were seeing is we were facing bigger and bigger problems emerging and old problems not going away. Failed wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, lack of preparedness for emerging threats, slowness in the system, sluggishness all over, losing key technology edges. We could see it coming. And the country unprepared for a global pandemic and a whole lot more. I want to be clear about what we say in the book. Although we often use the expression things are broken, not everything's broken. For example, I think we would count how intelligence was matched to a whole set of actions in support to Ukraine as Russia was poised to invade. Probably nothing like it since Adlai Stevenson brought intelligence out at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was handled very well. But there are enough things that aren't working that we had thought it important to really see what's going on here. So that led us to a whole series of dinners at restaurants around town here with former cabinet officials, other key top generals and leaders, key thinkers, very importantly, people in the trenches, people doing the work every day, to try to get a sense of what's really happening. We did a lot of thinking, a lot of discussing before we ever put our fingers to the keyboard and really try to sort out what it was we were looking at. Brad has already highlighted the key paradox that we've really discovered here, and that is we spend in excess of $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion a year. Not with a B, but with a T. And we're puzzled by how often we get it wrong. You know, among the reasons for us is not just that we didn't think or we didn't anticipate, sometimes we didn't, but we think the machine as we call it, isn't working or isn't working as it should. And let me explain for just a moment what we call the machine, what it is. There's an element of the larger set of institutions that provides warning of problems that are arising. You might think of the intelligence community, but warning comes from a whole lot of different places. But that gets fused and concentrated and gets directed at the right people, at decision makers, so they can make decisions. But warning only works if another part of the machine, the action machine, is ready to receive it. And what we were seeing in this book is there are cases, to be sure, where the warning wasn't taking place. But there are more cases where the warning was there, but there wasn't a receptor on the other end, in the action machine, as we call it, to make things work. So from our standpoint, if we're really going to respond to the kind of challenges that we see emerging, we have to have both of these pieces lined up properly. A warning machine that's going to provide all of the information you need to know about what's going on in the world. And we'll talk a bit more in a minute about how we want to open the aperture on that. But if the warning machine has to send the signals, the prompts of these are the problems that are coming. But then you have to have an action machine on the other end that's going to be able to deal with it, that's going to be able to that's going to be ready to be put into motion or put into action when the leadership calls on it. That's what we talk about in the book. Tom, why don't I turn to you and let you pull on that puzzle a little bit more.
Sure. Thanks, Andy. And again, thank you all for coming out on a rainy Saturday to join us here. You know, I'd like to take you back to 9/11. Andy was inside the building on that day. I was getting off the D6 bus at Farragut North, switching to the blue line to go to my desk at the Pentagon. This is Washington, D.C., so anybody who was in town, this was a visceral, painful attack on ourselves, on our hometown. And to be sure, we haven't faced a similar catastrophic terror attack since then. And that's a great credit to all the people who work these issues here and abroad, and to make sure that that remains true, that there isn't another catastrophic attack. But that was more than 2 decades ago. And what's happened since is that the focus, the Zoom-like focus on counterterrorism, crowded out so many other issues. We used a microscope when it was time to switch to a telescope. We were on Zoom, and that did not let us see a host of panoramic issues that have really crept up in the 20 years that we were circling this strategic cul-de-sac called the Middle East. And that's one of the things that Andy and I really, really point to. Now, don't get me wrong, any death above 0 is a tragedy. On 9/11, 3,000 people died. Those scars will never heal. But think about what happened. This nation launched 2 forever wars, spent trillions of dollars, thousands of Americans have died, even more in the Middle East. Compare that to COVID. Death toll is 1 million and rising, and this nation never went onto a war footing. And arguments continue today about how significant is the pandemic and what should be done. Clorox versus masks. I mean, it's just crazy to think where this country went during pandemic. And what Andy and I argue is that we can no longer define national security through tools that kill people and blow things up. We simply need a broader, more sophisticated understanding of the problems that are emerging. And so we talk about in our book cyber and data security, climate security as national security, public health preparedness as national security, and even food security. And we'll talk more about that. You know, in our book, on that last point, Andy and I traveled to Kansas State University, Manhattan, Kansas. They call it the Little Apple, wonderful name, where a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff became president. And he had read all the intelligence seized from Al-Qaeda caves and realized that Al-Qaeda early on was studying animal disease, crop blight, foot and mouth disease, brucellosis, and how transportable it is. So this Kansas State University president, a former chairman, lobbied and got billions of dollars from the government to build a national bio-agro defense facility that most people have never even heard of. And it's just opening right now. It's under its tests today, because this general knew something had to be done to protect us from a threat that nobody was focusing on. I mean, we have this constellation of nuclear laboratories all over the country studying nuclear weapons and effects. How could we not have laboratories preparing us for biological and agricultural threats? And you think that it's not possible. It really is. Andy and my reporting took us to some history. In 1997 in New Zealand, there were a bunch of farmers who were angered at the fact that New Zealand didn't allow a certain kind of rabbit pesticide, because wild rabbits, I guess, are as plentiful as hobbits in New Zealand. And so one of these farmers traveled to the Czech Republic, where a rabbit virus that causes death by hemorrhaging is allowed. He put it on his handkerchief. This virus lives for 7 days, flew to New Zealand, and suddenly in 97 and 98, the New Zealand government found just a pandemic of wild rabbits dying from this horrible disease. So if you think it can't happen or it's difficult, just imagine a terrorist, or even naturally occurring brucellosis, hoof and mouth disease breaking out here. Well, this lab is a new line of defense. Cyber, the same way. You know, I wrote so often, as did Brad and others, about the threat of a cyber Pearl Harbor, that some adversary could turn off the lights on the East Coast, crash the healthcare system, crash the financial system. But while we were looking for the big Pearl Harbor, China did a quiet Pearl Harbor, the largest theft of intellectual property in world history. Billions and billions of dollars China stole from us. And it's no accident that the new generation Chinese stealth fighter looks a lot like the American stealth fighter, because they got the plans without having to pay for the R&D. Russia, place I lived 5 years. My wife calls it 5 winters. That's one of the few things that we disagree on. You know, we call Putin's Russia the threat hiding in plain sight. Everything Putin has done that has surprised us, he told us he was going to do in advance. But we didn't listen. We wished it away. We willfully thought that the new Russia would enter the European orbit and it wouldn't be a problem. I'm often asked, is there a new Cold War with Russia? That's the wrong question. Putin is at war with us today. Let me repeat that. Putin is at war with us today. What is election hacking other than an attempt at regime change? Putin did that. One of the strengths of our democracy is that we're very binary. It's hard to take this country to war, and that's a wonderful thing. Peace, war, on, off. Not so in Putin's Russia. Vladimir Putin has a very he views war as a continuum of conflict, like he has a rheostat. And it goes from, you know, things like disinformation, election hacking, all the way to invading the sovereign territory of a neighbor. And we are just not prepared for this kind of threat. Andy and I interviewed the 4-star Air Force general who ran the NATO military in 2014 when Russia first invaded Ukraine, the first invasion. He told us that NATO and the US had zero tactical warning that Putin was going to invade Ukraine. He was so angry, he said, he went off like a well-hit 9-iron in a tile bathroom. I just love that image. And he flew to Washington and met with all of the intelligence chiefs to say, how could this have happened? How could a Russian army prepare to invade a sovereign nation and you not know? And what he was told, it was a matter of intention and investment. On the day before the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, about 15,000 American officials in the warning machine that he talked about were focused on the Soviet Union. 15,000. The day before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, that number dwindled to 1,000. The day before the Berlin Wall fell, 50% of the intelligence budget went to watching the Soviet Union. On the day before the invasion of Ukraine, 2014, that had dropped to 15%. Counterterrorism, other issues had so squashed our ability to watch Russia that we were caught blind. Now, to be sure, the core of Russia analysts who remained are first-rate people. Andy and I interviewed a lot of them. I found out after leaving the Times that many of them are my neighbors. I'd be at the recycling bin. It's like, oh, you didn't work in agriculture all these years? You're with which agency? So, and they're great people and they're very, very smart. But numbers matter, focus matters, attention matters, and that's just Russia. The other pacing threat is China.
I mentioned slowness a little bit ago. I was the person leading the strategy review at the Pentagon when the 9/11 attack took place. The focus at that time was really to begin thinking and preparing for what China's military modernization was going to mean. A lot of attention was being given to it. There were some really talented, far-seeing people that had been pointing to this challenge that was going to be in the future. We spoke to, perhaps the top of those thinkers, a fellow named Andy Marshall, often known as the Yoda of the Pentagon. We saw him just a few months before his death. And he reminded us in that discussion that as far back as 1985, people began thinking and saying they didn't know with certainty, but what they could see was that China's own economic development, its own economic progression, was putting it on a pace that was going to allow it to support a military modernization should it choose to do so. 1985, he and a colleague and an economist made a projection that they thought the Chinese economy would surpass the Soviet economy by 2010. Now, they weren't projecting the end of the Cold War at that moment, but they were seeing how this was diverging, and they thought this was the time to begin preparing. This is the warning machine sending signals. But of course, as Tom said, 9/11 came, and so this focus to begin with sort of this steady preparation on China just had to wait. Had to wait for certainly the aftermath of 9/11, had to wait for the war in Afghanistan, definitely had to wait for when the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan were both underway. And there were a lot of people at the time that thought, time's on our side. We've got this enormous advantage. If those that might think back to the mid-90s, there was a Taiwan Strait crisis in which China had fired some missiles that were described as bracketing the island, that is, firing to the left of the island or to the right of the island, sending a signal, using weapons to send a diplomatic signal. And the United States sent two carriers, in fact, two aircraft carriers. Only one of them made it to the strait. The other got called off beforehand. Steamed through the Taiwan Strait, crisis over, because the leadership in China at the time knew that they weren't capable of taking on the U.S. military. We had too much advantage at that time. Time was on our side, but years have elapsed. Years go by, decades go by. It's now 20 years later. And many of the advantages that we saw then don't exist now. We went from a position of great advantage to maybe one of parity today. When you get into the book and you read in this section, one of the pieces that really caught our attention is when we sat with a top general in the Pentagon. And he laments the one thing they were seeing in the war games they were running. So they run these war games repeatedly, and they do it to try to learn, apply lessons, reflect that in their own choices about technology they're buying, reflect that in training that's underway, and then bring that back to the next game. And what he said to us, what he was seeing in war game after war game, is that they were simply losing faster. But that's not the most frightening of all of when we look at how warning and action were being paired. I mentioned we'd had these dinners with people, and we always ended every one of these discussions with the parting question as we're wrapping things up, when we'd lean in and say, but what worries you most? And what we were hearing time after time was that we were not ready for a global pandemic that was almost certain to come. That was in 2017, 2018, and 2019. And that was coming from people with backgrounds in intelligence, with backgrounds in broad national security policy. It was coming as well from people in public health fields, but it was coming from so many different places. The signals were pouring in, but we weren't ready. And we all know what the result of that was. And that's because the action machine that I talked about at the beginning of this, the action machine wasn't in place. The warning was there, but even if someone was ready to act, we didn't have the pieces in place. And that's one of the things that really did catch our attention. So what do? You'll read the story here of a public health official who I think correctly wants to think about public health preparedness the way we think about military readiness. There's not a soldier or a Marine out there who hasn't heard of Task Force Smith. Task Force Smith is the unit we sent early in the Korean War onto the Korean Peninsula, and it wasn't ready, and it faced terrible casualties. It wasn't the fault of the task force itself. It was a fault of the system. They were untrained. They didn't have the right weapons. They were outgunned, and they had significant losses. This public health official looks at the problems that we had during the pandemic and wants to view that the way a soldier and a Marine looks at Task Force Smith. The military thinks about readiness as the idea that you're ready to fight tonight, not tomorrow, not the next day, no pickup games. When we look at the kind of problems that we're talking about here, we need to be ready for the next pandemic. And the physician who we were talking to wants us to be ready to care for people tonight, just as the military wants to be ready to fight tonight. Create the system, build the training, buy the needed stocks to jumpstart the process, even know who to call when the warning message is blinking red, when that message comes in. We learned a great deal from the pandemic, but we haven't fixed the machine. We need to do it. Tom.
Thanks, Andy. The machine that we are talking about today was basically built in 1947, after World War II. The Department of Defense was formed, CIA, United Nations, NATO. Fantastic institutions have served us well. But as a former national security advisor told us, it's time just to park that 47 Chevy in the garage and get a new car. And so that's what we're talking about here. There were major reforms after 9/11, but again, they were all focused on counterterrorism, which does not include this more expansive definition of national security that Andy and I are advocating for. I also want to make clear, as Brad said in the introduction, we spend about $1.2 trillion on national security. You are not looking at two people advocating for more money. We're not saying give the Defense Department more money. We want the money that's spent now across the system to be spent smarter and wiser and in new and creative ways. You know, we've been sort of like the athlete, our military, that does one thing really, really well. But we now need to make the national security apparatus, a pentathlete, or ready to compete in a decathlon. It has to do 10, 15, 20 things well, and we have the money for it, people, if it's just spent wiser and in smarter ways. And we're also not advocating creating a bunch of new institutions like after 9/11, when the National Counterterrorism Center was set up, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, Northern Command. Those are fine. They're functioning well. But what we are advocating is, again, a more agile, creative way of thinking. We interviewed the 4-star general who absolutely reorganized Special Operations Forces to make it an incredibly lethal and potent killing machine. He's an advocate of turning the U.S. government not into a killing machine, but into a life-saving machine. To put that same intelligence, knock down the walls between the FBI and CIA and Health and Human Services and Treasury, and bring them together in new and creative ways. We interviewed a former defense secretary, who was also a former CIA director, and oh, by the way, a former OMB director, because you have to follow the money. I mean, you can talk the good talk, but if there's not budget money put on a problem, it's just a fantasy. And he too advocates creation of what we're calling standing joint task forces to deal with a cyber crisis, to deal with a health crisis, to deal with a data crisis, to deal with this food crisis. Because you don't know when it's coming or where it will come from, but rather than creating new institutions, let's get people with the expertise from all across the government. Bring them together 4 times a year. Train, practice, get to know each other, see where the strengths are, what should be stockpiled, where are we short, what do we have, so that if any of these predictable problems arise, we're ready. And this exercise, this muscle movement, will also help us be ready when the unpredictable surprise comes along. Before I turn it over to Andy for the concluding thoughts, I'd like to share with you the 2 really soulful takeaways that I have from the last 5 years of research. One is that Andy wrote a line in our conclusion that, of course, when I was editing it, and it sort of was nice, but the more I've thought about it, it has really, really stuck with me. We may talk about the national security machine, the warning machine, the action machine, but we're really talking about people. And there's been no more important time ever in our history where the kind of people that we put in government, the kind of people we attract to government, the kind of people we elect to lead us, it's so important that we get people who can help end this period of polarization, which is an absolute national security threat. I'm not advocating a specific candidate, not a specific party, but we've got to get to a place where there's a bipartisan approach to keeping our nation safe. And the other epiphany I had is that the future needs a seat at the table. Our government's designed to deal with the problems tomorrow, the problems next week, the problems running up to the election. No, we have to have people who are empowered to think around the corner and toward the horizon, because it's the short-term thinking, the crocodile closest to the canoe or the kayak. We have to look on shore, over land, and in the sky to be ready to keep our nation safe. Andy?
Let me tell you just a little bit more about the book itself and how we developed it. It could have been a much, much longer book. It might have even been several books. But what we tried to do is take you inside these stories that we tell. So you're going to find characters in here. We've mentioned a few names along the way. I think you're going to enjoy meeting these people. They're just really interesting. They're all patriots. They're all dedicated to really thinking hard about American security. The thing that all of them are coming away with from their various vantage points and is the idea we mentioned already, but I want to mention again that the problems are just too important right now for pickup games. We need to have plans in place, training, supplies for some of these things. These problems are coming at us, and we need to be ready in a very, very serious way. Tom mentioned, it was the genius of the national security leaders of 75 years ago that built the machinery that we're living off today. Much of that's represented in the National Security Act of 1947. That's the point in which we created the Department of Defense. We created the intelligence community. The National Security Council system that operates today was all part of that act. We've added to it over time. We need a new modern version of that. When we look back at the genius of what they built, they were wrestling with their own problems at that time. The fear then, and rightly, was how to avoid nuclear war in the world. We've done that so far. The machine they built wasn't perfect, but it delivered. It delivered time and time again, but it's not delivering sufficiently now. It's time to build that new system. We had a really nice conversation with our friend, former chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Mac Thornberry. And, Mac came away from that discussion with us, and he has this on the back cover of the book, but, his line was, no more excuses. We know what the problem is. No more excuses. We need to fix this. It reminded me of a line that I came across some years ago. It was JFK in one of his State of the Union speeches was calling for fixing a different kind of problem, but I love the image he created. When he called this out, he said, the best time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. I think we need to face it we need a new roof. And that's really where we end up in this book. Thank you very, very much. We look forward to your questions.
So we'd love to take some questions. We have 25 minutes. If you would come to the microphone, please, because this is being recorded by Politics and Prose. Microphone's right up here. Please.
In December, I graduated with my master's degree in international security, and I am
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. And I'm currently a teacher, but I am looking to move into the national security arena. So my question to you is, what is your maybe one or several pieces of advice that you would give a person trying to currently enter the sphere, the national security arena?
Tom, I'm going to start. I get this question often, and first off, congratulations. It's a complicated arena you're entering, and there are a lot of various pathways into it. Tom's was journalism. Mine actually began with journalism. I worked for the Marine Corps Gazette, which is a monthly journal written for the Marine Corps officers as I was coming out of graduate school. I had never envisioned that I would be there. But what I learned from my time at the Marine Corps Gazette is it prepared me so well for when I got into the Pentagon. Look for those circuitous routes. You know, there's no direct pathway in. One of the things we argue in this book, and strongly, is the idea that there's a public sector that plays such a critical role. But the kind of problems we're talking about aren't going to be solved if the public and private sector aren't working together. So, yes, look for that job in the intelligence community or the Pentagon or the State Department, or increasingly what people are talking about, you know, as we think about the new Joint Chiefs at Treasury and Commerce, as we think about trade and sanctions as tools of foreign policy. But don't overlook the private sector opportunities, the NGOs that play such critical roles, and so forth. It's not probably going to be a direct path into this career. It's going to be a circuitous one, but be sure to sort of have fun along the way. Fun as in stay involved, stay committed, learn what you can, and there's really exciting opportunities out there for you.
It's interesting because we have not practiced that question. It's the first time we've gotten it, but we're in total agreement. There's no place worth going that you can get to by a shortcut. You know, do the hard work, pay your dues. I don't like the word mentor, it's just odd, but do find people more experienced than you and try to work with really smart people. I mean, I found in the workplace that there are those who view competence as competition. Don't be that kind of person. You know, one of the reasons I became as good a journalist as I am is I befriended reporters who were way better than me. And that's the secret. And finally, think of what you're doing as a calling. I mean, in very different ways. One reason that reporters and people in the military, you think we would never get along, but the best military personnel and the best reporters both view what they do as a calling to make our country stronger. And there's real power in that. And good luck to you.
Thank you very much. Two questions. First is about structure. So I'm just wondering, you may have addressed this, Tom, earlier, about the structure of our national security. We have both the situation with Congress authorizing and appropriating once per year, or if on average. And then secondarily, we have an issue of the frozen middle, the situation of large numbers of people in our defense structure who don't want to change or adapt in a situation. So that's the first one. The secondary is about what about engaging with soft power, appreciating the value of the State Department, the CDC, NIH, and all these organizations that I think they could have caught COVID before it became a problem. So what about approaching that instead of like worrying about the dangers, but trying to reduce the threat itself?
So both are great questions, and they're both answered in the book, so thank you for asking. Second question first. We are absolute believers in soft power. We don't really use that phrase per se, but one of our interviews is, again, with a former defense secretary who was a Sovietologist, and he bemoans the fact that of all the tools no longer in our arsenal is a strong United States information agency. I mean, Lisa and I were in Moscow when people used to string wire all the way around their apartments to make an antenna big enough to pick up Voice of America, Radio Free Europe. Yes, they listened for the jazz and the rock and roll, but they got real news, and this country could puncture the Iron Curtain with fact-based news that way. And there's nothing like that today to pierce Putin's electronic Iron Curtain. So we are absolute believers in all of the different aspects of government being brought together and not just things that blow up and kill people. And then as far as the structure, I know Andy has thoughts on budgets and stuff too. Partisanship, this country is not strong if it's broke, and this country is not strong if it can't work together. So these year by year spending plans and all that, it's really, really destabilizing. But
I'm just going to make one point about what I think is a very important issue about budgeting. And an observation we make is it's unfortunate that Congress, in playing its oversight roles, too often replicates the stovepipes that are the institutions themselves. You'll see in our depiction here, we're talking about building scaffolding, creating the horizontal pieces that'll connect these institutions. And that's a really very important role for Congress. So if I'm looking for the kind of reform we're talking about, the modern version of the National Security Act, I want to look very seriously at Congress and its role as both authorizer and appropriator, because that's the place where some of these connections can be done, this connective tissue can be drawn there, and then we want to see it replicated across these institutions. So I think you're really wise to be focused on that.
Thank you.
All right, question for you. So I'm coming at this from a little bit more of kind of the business perspective, but you talk about the machine being broken and sort of the misappropriation of, $1 trillion of federal budget. What role do you think like the defense contracting community takes in that, right? So I don't know what percentage of the $1 trillion budget goes to companies like Raytheon and Lockheed and stuff like that, but I got to imagine it's a pretty significant amount. These guys are all generating 10, 20%, profit margins. So think of that as a tax on this money. And then beyond that, they've got kind of perverse incentives to continue pushing products that we may not necessarily need, but that they're generating profit on. So how do you guys think about that and, any proposed solutions to that kind of issue?
I'm going to start first with the question about the private sector and defense industry in particular. It's part of the slowness that we see in this. By the way, I have no problem with industry earning reasonable margins on their work. No problem with it all. But there's a lethargy that's in this, and it's crowding out some of the new ideas that are coming from other parts of the private sector. And this is the part I think that worries me and importantly worries the people that are running the Pentagon now, not just this administration, but the prior one and those before it. They talk about this notion of the valley of death. That's where new ideas are coming up, very promising things, but it takes a lot of money to get those across sort of from initial development to actual production. And all the while, there are very big, important parts of defense industry. They're good at this, but they're slow at it, and they want control of it. A good example for us right now is the F-35. This is the latest fighter that's being fielded right now. That plane was developed almost 35 years ago. 35 years ago. It's being fielded in significant numbers right now. But this country was able to develop and field aircraft in 5, 7, 10 years in the 50s and 60s. Now, they were less complicated. We know that for sure. They were never intended to last as long as current aircraft do. But this is an illustration of some of the problem that we have when it takes 35 years to field a new aircraft. And as Tom points out, in midst of that cycle, some of our competitors are putting out very good technology that are competing very effectively with us. So if you're going to fix the system, you're going to fix defense industry as well as fixing the federal institutions that we're talking about in Congress. There's all of these pieces are going to have to be looked at really carefully.
One of the cabinet members now retired that we interviewed made the point that, again, it's about leadership. And too many people in government can say no, and not enough can say yes. An example of that is the mine-resistant vehicle that was fielded in Iraq and Afghanistan when roadside bombs were maiming and killing Americans at an absolutely unacceptable rate. The individual services didn't want to pull their money out to do it. Industry wasn't really into it. They didn't think it was a long-term investment. But one defense secretary said, the lives of these troops, the lives of these soldiers, Marines, airmen, etc., is more important than your service, parochial, industry, or congressional interests. One defense secretary drove that, billions of dollars, and saved lives. And so it really is about leadership, and it's about having the people in the jobs who know when to say yes, and not just a lot of people who can take the easy route and say no.
Maybe a quick follow-up to that. So if you think about the pie chart of government spend, right, and you talked about this at the beginning of this, about how, wars are not going to be fought with bombs and, ballistics anymore. If you sort of, in your ideal world, if you think about the pie chart of the things that you talk about, cybersecurity, health defense, what's kind of your ideal split of where we should be allocating funds, right? I would say that we're probably over-indexed to, battlefield mechanisms right now, right? So I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are on where we should be spending the money.
It's a great question, and not being a numbers guy, I'm not going to give you
Sure.
a direct answer, but I'll give you kind of a conceptual framework for it. Remember when that gas pipeline company got hacked a couple years ago? Right?
Sure.
Terrible crisis. Fuel at the pump went up dollars and all that sort of stuff. If memory serves, they did not reach out for government assistance right away. They were concerned about, opening their books, shareholder value, all that sort of stuff. We have to have new tools and protections in place so that the private sector, when it has these problems, can open up to the government and vice versa. So I can't tell you where the pie chart comes down, but there has to be a real look at your question to say, how does the government and private industry work together more effectively?
I've looked at the numbers a little bit more over time. I don't think we're talking about moving double digits in percentages to fix some of these problems. I think we can be seriously talking about single digits of movement of the overall pie, the $1.25 trillion we're spending. If you had 3, 4, 5% of that to deal with some of these new problems, you could make enormous headway. We talk about pandemic preparedness, stockpiling basic supplies. This doesn't require enormous expenditures to have some of that in place. Fortunately, one of the outgrowths of the post 9/11 reforms was the fact that we did get started on the research on new vaccines. The mRNA vaccine would not have been with us had it not been for the research that was underway after 9/11 and some of the authorities that were given, that were put into law at that time. It doesn't take hundreds of billions of dollars to keep some of those things active and alive. We want to do that in a serious way right now. The new issue that a lot of people are worried about, and we know the folks in the White House are deeply worried about, generative AI. How we're going to put guardrails around that, how we're going to think about that functioning and so forth. That's come on us very quickly. Again, the government expenditures don't have to be huge, and the key drivers here are the private sector. Right now, there's about a half dozen firms that have the wherewithal to be able to do this at any kind of a scale. This is going to require a public and private partnership, but again, as a former national security advisor sat and talked to us at length, we have to have the wherewithal so that we can cooperate with these institutions, so they can signal to the federal government when problems are arising, and not fear that they're going to be paying a huge penalty when they're revealing data or revealing about things about themselves, when they're motivated by basic national security. Now, nobody's here to suggest that we want to turn a blind eye to fraud or abuse or blatant violations of the law. But we do need to have sort of a more cooperative structure here that's going to work. But to your point, I think single digits in that larger expenditure can make a huge difference.
And if I could just foot stomp something Andy said, it was a horrible period, pandemic. A million people died. The economy overturned. But it was a proof of concept, a tragic one, for our idea of the Standing Joint Task Force. The government stumbled badly when COVID came. We don't need to revisit that history. But think about Operation Warp Speed. Brought together the best minds in government, best minds in business, best minds in science. It gave them the money, gave them the legal protections, and guess what? The vaccine was produced in record time. So we need to use that concept on all the other challenges that we're talking about. That was from a standing start. Let's get ready so we don't have to do that stumble at the starting gate.
Thank you.
Would you please identify yourself?
So part of the story of this national security machine is how it's covered, right? And you guys can speak with two very different perspectives on that. And my question has two parts. First, how has it been covered? I think a lot of people have this somewhat naive notion that, reporters like Tom and I walk the Pentagon halls waiting for leaks to be dropped in our lap, and officials like Andy was, looking for ways to leak, and or not. Yeah. And we all know that that's really not the way it is, So give a little more sophisticated view of how the process works. And secondly, how could it be better? Because we also all know that as good as the coverage has been at times, it's also been it hasn't served the nation well at other times. And we have just a few more minutes.
Yeah, we could do a whole hour on that, Brad. Thanks for the question. And you're an expert yourself. You could answer this for us. I mean, it's true. I never liked the phrase leaks because it makes it sound like a reporter is at his or her desk, feet up, smoking a cigar, drinking scotch. Phone rings. Mr. Secretary, what's my news today? It just doesn't work that way. If only it did. It does happen from time to time if government officials want to get a story out, set an agenda. But more than a leak, it's really a puncture. Reporters walk the halls, talk to people. Some of the coverage I'm proudest of my entire career were a series of stories written with my colleagues Eric Schmidt and David Sanger in 2002. The Bush administration was, taking its focus away from Afghanistan. There was talk about Iraq, but everybody top to bottom said, no, there's off-ramps. We're not going to invade Iraq, not a chance. Well, we began reporting that, no kidding, the Bush administration's planning for war. And I've always believed that there's no more grim decision that a democracy makes than going to war. And it was our obligation to tell the American people, this is what the government's planning in your name. And we wrote a series of stories starting in May of 2002, almost a full year before the invasion, that laid out the planning. We weren't printing where the troop ships are going to sail or what the plans are. We weren't going to risk lives, but we thought it was really, really important to tell the country what's going to happen, and it happened exactly as we said. So how do we make the coverage better? One of the catastrophes of the internet is the hollowing out of the American media. I mean, my alma mater, the Chicago Tribune, had bureaus in Moscow and all around the world, and now it's a very much smaller organization. So there is this Darwinian culling going on. There's only a few newspapers that really cover the world seriously, and that's just not right. I'm a believer in competition, because the more reporters you have out there, the more good stories you're going to get. So we have to support the mainstream media that's doing a good job. Please subscribe to your local newspapers. Please subscribe to the big ones. And these reporters have to be protected. It's really, really hard when our government declares war on the media. I mean, my 5 years in Moscow, my alma mater, the Chicago Tribune, and my reporting, I was labeled an enemy of the state just before Lisa and I came home. It was very, very hard on me to be at the New York Times and have my own government label the news media an enemy of the people. That's just wrong. And again, there's always going to be a rub between the government and national security coverage. But we're in this together to make our country better. There has to be better rules of engagement.
Brad, my own experience is that
Oh, let's see.
my own experience is that the best reporting is really one of collaboration. That is, reporters and officials in and out of government are interacting. This is an ongoing dialogue on critical issues. When I got to know you and I got to know Tom and others, often when we were sitting down to talk about problems, you came in so well prepared that I knew you knew the answers to most of the questions you were asking before we ever sat down. You were there to confirm your answers, but you were were very, very well. You understood the institutions you were covering. You understood the issues you were writing about, and that sense of collaboration. You would travel with officials. You'd talk to them, and you're communicating with a larger, with your readership. But you're really communicating with the American population when you're doing that. When the reporting is best, I think, and when the coverage is best, it represents some of that. Yes, there's occasional leaks and so forth, but more often there are deliberate acts to share information, to create awareness, to create understanding, and I think that's really important to how the democracy has to function. An electorate that is not aware, does not have an understanding, does not have an appreciation of the kind of issues that we're talking about, and these are issues that are so highly consequential for all of us that we need that collaboration. So from my standpoint, and the vantage point I had both when I was in the Defense Department, but even the time I've had since at Rand, I think it's such an important role. And I know that some of Tom's colleagues at the New York Times, I used to appreciate it when they had a story almost finished, and we'd get a call and say, "Can we come over and talk to you about this? Because we just want to make sure that we've got some of these points right." The folks, the top reporters in the national security space, they know what they're talking about, and they're really, really good.
So just a final thought. I've always sort of believed that the relationship between the media and the U.S. government is like a marriage. Now, it's a dysfunctional marriage, but we stay together for the kids, right? And the kids are all of you, because we have to make this relationship work.
Anybody else?
I know we're just about out of time, but I thought I'd ask a question about the future. First of all, Tom and Andy, thank you for the book. Congratulations again. I'm looking forward to reading it. The question about the future kind of actually relates back to something one of the first people up here asked a question about careers in the defense industry. A little bit of context for the audience. I mean, I've had a long career, 20 years in the private sector and 20 years at the periphery of the defense and national security area. And I had the privilege of working with some of the most dedicated and intelligent and well-intentioned professionals. Andy, you're one of those people. But in listening to your remarks today, I was thinking, what does the future look like? What's your assessment of the future? Because one of you said, and very truthfully, I mean, one of you said, these machines you're talking about, both the intelligence machine and the action machine, it's really people we're talking about. And so my question is, what's your assessment, and whether it's in the book or whether you have discussions about the future generations? Is the educational system generating the kinds of people with the enthusiasm, the intelligence, the background, and the dedication to work some of the problems that you're astutely pointing out that we need? And also, is the system, is the defense industry, the defense establishment, the intelligence side and the action side, actually recruiting people, incentivizing people, increasing the talent pool? What's your view about that future?
I think you raise a profoundly important question here. People we've all met over our careers have dedicated themselves to their country and to these causes. They've Tom's reference earlier, the advice, think of this as a calling. You know, the best minds that I've seen over my career have viewed this as a calling, and there's some amazing talent that have been part of this national security establishment. You know, I think of the likes of Harold Brown, a genius. The man graduated from Columbia, I think at 16, earned a PhD at 21, was Secretary of the Air Force at 32 or 33 years old, and continued to serve the balance of his life. I think the talent in this country is as good as it has ever been. I do worry a bit of whether that talent's attracted to service in the same way that the likes of a Harold Brown was? You know, do they feel motivated? Do they feel committed to a larger cause in the same way? And that's a concern, because we need that talent. We need every bit of it to focus. These problems that we're outlining in this book are every bit as hard as the problems of the early days of the nuclear age. And, you know, serious people focused on that then, and thankfully they got it enough right that we've avoided nuclear war for 75 years. But you think about you know, the unknowns that surround generative AI and what that could be bringing. This feels to me an awful lot like the beginning of the nuclear era. We're going to need the best talent that's available to be working on those problems. So, you know, the education system, I think we could have a separate discussion of whether it's producing, you know, if it's producing, you know, enough people with backgrounds in science and technology and so forth, the so-called, you know, the STEM areas. I think there's plenty of good talent. My biggest concern is whether that talent's moved and motivated and feels that calling to put its skills and its brain power on the kind of problems that we're talking about here, because we need it.
Thank you.
So thank you, Tom, and